The crack of her hand against my face was so loud that it seemed to echo against the porcelain plates, the crystal glasses, the heavy silence of the dining room. For a split second, I thought even the candles flickered at the violence of the moment, their light trembling in disbelief. My mother's palm had left a burning sting across my cheek, but what pierced me deeper was not the physical pain. It was the public humiliation. Everyone around the long oak table froze, eyes wide, mouths half open as if words had been stolen from them mid-sentence. My father's fork hung in the air. My cousin's wine glass trembled just before it slipped from her hand. I sat still, paralyzed not by weakness, but by a storm of emotions that tangled inside my chest. Rage wanted to rise. Shame begged me to lower my head. But something unfamiliar, a cold clarity, began to pulse in my veins. Margaret, my mother, didn't flinch. She sat with her back straight, eyes fixed on me with a look that was sharper than the slap itself, her lips pressed into a thin line, her breathing steady, as though she had rehearsed this moment all her life. "You've always been a disgrace," she spat, her voice venomous yet controlled, every syllable dipped in contempt. It wasn't the first time she had humiliated me, not by far, but never before had she dared to make her contempt this public. The guests at the table, the family who had come together for this carefully orchestrated dinner, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, caught between loyalty, fear, and disbelief. I could feel my cheeks swelling, heat radiating like fire, yet it was her words, not her hand, that scorched deeper. To her right sat Gerald, my father, as motionless as a statue. He didn't speak, didn't move, didn't even blink, as though the moment had turned him to stone. His silence was no surprise. Silence had always been his contribution to the battles Margaret chose to wage. He had lived his entire marriage as her shadow, nodding when told to, retreating when necessary, never raising his voice against her tyranny. His eyes, however, betrayed him. They darted toward me with something resembling guilt, though he quickly looked away, as if ashamed to acknowledge my pain. His cowardice weighed heavier than the slap itself. On the other side of the table, Daniel smirked faintly, my brother's lips twitching into something between amusement and triumph. He had always been the golden child, Margaret's pride and joy, her reflection of perfection. I could almost hear his thoughts. "Finally, she put you in your place." His smirk was fleeting, but in that flicker of expression, I recognized years of rivalry and cruelty that had festered beneath our sibling bond. He wasn't surprised by the slap. He had probably been waiting for it, savoring it as proof that I would always be the failure compared to him. His smugness made my blood boil, yet at the same time, it gave me strength. Further down the table sat my aunt and cousins, their faces pale, eyes darting nervously between my mother and me. One cousin dropped her fork, the metallic clatter cutting through the silence like a scream. No one dared to speak. The weight of appearances pressed down on them harder than any moral obligation to defend me. Margaret had raised them all to believe that image was everything, that loyalty to her authority meant survival in this family. To question her, even in this grotesque moment, would mean becoming the next target. They sat frozen, complicit in their silence, proving to me once again how deeply her power had infected us all. The longer the silence stretched, the louder my own heartbeat became, drumming in my ears like a war cry I hadn't known I carried. My cheek throbbed, tears threatened to surface, but I refused to let them fall. Not here, not now. This slap was not just about tonight's dinner. It was the culmination of years of emotional bruises, of words that had cut deeper than knives, of being the family's scapegoat. Every belittling comment, every dismissive glance, every cold shoulder seemed to crystallize into this single moment. It was as if Margaret's hand had summoned the ghosts of all her past cruelties to strike me at once. And yet, as her eyes burned into mine with disgust, I felt something shift. For the first time, I didn't shrink under her glare. I didn't lower my head like I had always been conditioned to. Instead, I looked back at her, directly, steadily, without blinking. My silence became my weapon, my refusal to collapse the very rebellion she had feared all along. In that stillness, in that locked gaze, I could see her falter for just a fraction of a second. It was brief, almost invisible, but enough for me to recognize that her power was not as invincible as she wanted everyone to believe. The table seemed suspended in time. Forks remained frozen, glasses untouched, conversations dead in the air. The faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner was the only sound breaking the suffocating stillness. My breath came slow, controlled, as though my body was preparing itself for something monumental. The sting on my cheek reminded me I was alive, that I had endured worse than this behind closed doors. But tonight, something in me refused to let this humiliation pass like all the others. Tonight would be different. With a deliberate slowness, I pushed back my chair, the screech of wood against the floor echoing through the suffocated room. Every head turned toward me, eyes widening, jaws tightening, the air vibrating with anticipation. I rose to my feet, my hands trembling slightly, but my resolve stronger than ever. My mother's eyes narrowed, daring me to speak, to retaliate, to defy her in front of the entire family. For once, I wasn't afraid. The room held its breath, waiting for the war that was about to unfold. When I look back on my childhood, it is not warmth or laughter that fills my memory, but the cold rigidity of a house where love was rationed like a currency I could never afford. Margaret, my mother, ruled every corner of our home with precision, as if life itself were a stage play, and she the director of every breath we took. The curtains had to be drawn at exactly the same hour each evening, shoes placed in perfect alignment by the door, and smiles worn like masks whenever company arrived. Perfection wasn't just her obsession, it was her religion, and she demanded worship from everyone under her roof. I was never good enough to meet her impossible standard, and perhaps that was why she had chosen me as her living example of failure, a warning to the rest of the family of what happens when you fall short. Gerald, my father, was the silent accomplice to her tyranny. He was a tall man with broad shoulders, but his presence carried no protection, only absence. His silences were louder than words, his indifference sharper than any insult. Whenever Margaret scolded, belittled, or humiliated me, I would search his face for rescue, for some flicker of defense. But his eyes would drop, his jaw would tighten, and he would retreat into himself like a soldier abandoning a battlefield before the fight even began. In his cowardice, I learned the cruelest lesson of all, that sometimes those who should shield you from harm are the very ones who let you bleed. Then there was Daniel, my brother, whose very existence was a constant reminder of my inadequacy. He was everything I was not, praised, adored, lifted onto a pedestal so high that the sun itself seemed to shine more brightly on him. When he brought home a report card, Margaret framed it like a work of art. When I dared to bring mine, marked with struggles and imperfections, she would arch her brow and sigh as though my existence were an inconvenience she had yet to correct. Daniel was the golden child, the masterpiece she flaunted to the world, while I was the flaw she tried desperately to conceal. Our rivalry wasn't just born of sibling jealousy. It was cultivated, nurtured by Margaret's deliberate comparisons, her endless declarations that I would never measure up. I became the scapegoat in a household that thrived on image. If a glass broke, it was my clumsiness. If the dog barked too loudly, it was my failure to train it. If Daniel was moody, it was because I had annoyed him. Every small mishap became a charge against me, and Margaret served as both judge and executioner. I learned to carry guilt like a second skin, to apologize before words even formed in my mouth. The weight of blame was suffocating, and yet I bore it in silence, thinking perhaps if I absorbed enough of it, one day she would look at me differently. But that day never came. One memory has never left me, the day she humiliated me at school. I had been 8 years old, fragile and eager to please, when a teacher raised her voice at me for forgetting my homework. Tears welled in my eyes, and I sobbed quietly at my desk, ashamed of my mistake. Margaret was called in, and instead of comforting me, she dragged me into the hallway, her voice sharp and merciless. "Stop embarrassing me," she hissed, gripping my arm so tightly I could feel her nails through my skin. "Crying is weakness. Do you want the world to see what a pathetic child you are?" I remember the sting of her words more than the sting of her grip, and I remember the way the other children looked at me, pity etched into their wide eyes. From that day, I learned to swallow my tears, to bury them so deep that even I could not find them. Despite the cruelty, or perhaps because of it, I longed for love with a hunger that consumed me. Every glance I stole toward Margaret was a desperate search for approval. Every small act of obedience a silent plea for her to see me, to choose me, to love me. But her affection was reserved for Daniel, and her admiration for herself. I tried to mimic Daniel's achievements, to copy his charm, but it was never enough. No matter what I did, her gaze would pass through me as if I were invisible. My father's silence, my brother's smirk, my mother's disdain, all conspired to convince me I was unworthy of love. Yet deep inside, a flame still flickered, the stubborn hope that one day I would prove them wrong. As the years stretched on, Rebellion began to grow inside me like a seed planted in the cracks of concrete. At first it was subtle, a slammed door, a defiant glance, a refusal to smile when she demanded it. Then it grew louder. Arguments, skipped dinners, sneaking out at night just to breathe air that wasn't poisoned by her perfection. Each act of defiance was both terrifying and exhilarating, a reminder that she did not own me completely, no matter how hard she tried. I knew it would cost me, and it did. Her punishments became harsher, her disdain colder, but the rebellion had taken root. I became two versions of myself, the obedient daughter she paraded before guests, and the wounded, defiant soul who hid behind closed doors, scribbling secrets into notebooks no one would ever read. That duality carved deep fractures into me, fractures that grew with every year I endured under her reign. On the outside, I learned to smile, to stand straight, to mimic Daniel's charm. But inside, I carried rage like a buried weapon, waiting for the day it would finally be unsheathed. I didn't know when that day would come, only that it was inevitable. Margaret had created the perfect storm, and one day, it would break. And so, as I stood at the dinner table years later, cheek burning from her slap, I understood that this was not just about tonight. It was about every wound, every humiliation, every denied plea for love. The child who once cried in the hallway at school, the teenager who slammed doors, the young woman who scribbled secrets in notebooks, they all rose within me, demanding justice. The slap wasn't the breaking point. It was the spark that set fire to the years of dry kindling she had piled around me. For the first time, I was not just her daughter. I was her reckoning. The dining room looked like something out of a magazine spread, every detail meticulously curated by my mother's perfectionist hand. The long oak table was covered with a white linen cloth, its surface gleaming under the glow of the chandelier that hung like a crown above us. Crystal glasses reflected the warm candlelight. Silver cutlery was placed with surgical precision, and dishes of roasted lamb, glazed vegetables, and delicate desserts lined the table as if posing for a camera. Margaret had orchestrated every detail, ensuring that nothing betrayed the cracks in our family facade. To an outsider, it was the perfect family reunion, a celebration of tradition and unity. But to me, it was a masquerade, a performance staged by a woman who lived for appearances. The guests murmured politely, laughter echoing lightly, though never too loudly, as if they too were actors playing roles in Margaret's script. My aunt clutched her wine glass delicately. My cousins whispered about college and careers. Daniel entertained with stories of his latest promotion, and Gerald, the silent patriarch, sat at the head of the table with a glass of whiskey he had barely touched. I watched them all, noting the subtle discomfort in their posture, the way their smiles tightened whenever Margaret spoke. They knew better than to challenge her, but they also knew that her control was exhausting, suffocating. Still, none dared to break character. After all, this was Margaret's stage, and to rebel against it was to invite her wrath. I hadn't been invited with warmth or anticipation. My presence at this dinner had felt more like an obligation than a desire, a stiffly worded email sent days before, reminding me of the date and time, as if my mother were summoning a reluctant employee rather than her own daughter. "Family is important, Natalie," she had written, though I knew she didn't believe those words. Family was important only insofar as it reflected her image of perfection. I arrived knowing that I would not be welcomed, only tolerated. My chair at the table was not prepared with love but with duty, as though leaving it empty would have been a blemish on her performance. Through the clinking of glasses and the rehearsed laughter, I endured her subtle jabs, each one sharper than the last. A comment about my choice of career, delivered with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. A dig at my appearance, disguised as motherly concern about whether I had been taking care of myself. A remark about how Daniel had always been driven compared to me, slipped casually into conversation as if it were harmless small talk. Each word was a knife wrapped in silk, leaving wounds that only I could feel. No one at the table would dare acknowledge the cruelty, not even with a glance. They would only sip their drinks, pretend not to notice, and continue playing their parts. I sat quietly, chewing food that tasted like dust in my mouth, the weight of her words heavier than any plate in front of me. The dinner was not about sharing a meal or celebrating family. It was about control, about Margaret proving to everyone that she held absolute authority, even over the children she claimed to love. Daniel basked in her approval, chiming in with jokes and anecdotes that won her laughter. as though rehearsed to perfection. Gerald kept his silence, his eyes cast downward, and I, the scapegoat, played the role she had assigned me since childhood, the black sheep, the silent failure, the reminder of what not to be. But beneath the surface of the performance, the tension was palpable. I could feel it thrumming in the air, like a violin string stretched too tightly, waiting for the inevitable snap. Conversations that appeared lighthearted carried a stiffness, as if everyone feared saying the wrong thing. Forks clicked against plates with exaggerated precision, glasses were refilled more often than necessary, and the laughter that bubbled up sounded forced, hollow, like echoes in an empty room. The entire dinner felt like a fragile house of cards, one breath away from collapsing into chaos. The truth is, Margaret wasn't just orchestrating a dinner, she was orchestrating an illusion, one that had lasted decades. Every smile, every compliment, every toast was carefully designed to conceal the fractures in our family. But no matter how much polish she applied, the cracks were there, growing deeper with every passing year. And as I sat at that table, I realized I was no longer willing to be part of her illusion. The slap, when it came, was not spontaneous. It was the climax of a performance she had been scripting since the moment I walked in. But what she didn't know was that I too had been preparing. As I sat with her words cutting into me, a voice rose within me, quiet but insistent. Not this time. It echoed louder than her insults, stronger than her contempt, filling my chest with a courage I hadn't felt in years. I would not be her scapegoat tonight. I would not swallow my shame or bury my rage to protect her illusion. The dinner may have begun as her performance, but it would not end that way. Somewhere deep inside me, a line had been crossed, and there would be no return. My teenage years were a battlefield, though not one with shouts and open warfare. No, it was a quieter war, fought in slammed doors, sharp words, and the icy silence that followed. Margaret loved to call me ungrateful whenever I resisted her control, as though demanding dignity was the same as betraying her sacrifices. She would recount the clothes she bought me, the meals she cooked, the roof she provided, as if those basic needs excused the wounds she inflicted. Every rebellion of mine, whether skipping a dinner, challenging her at the table, or choosing clothes she disapproved of, was framed as proof that I was an unworthy daughter. And yet, deep down, I knew my resistance was the only shred of myself I had left. What made her fury even more vicious was her obsession with appearances. Margaret would have rather died than let the world know her family wasn't perfect. She covered every crack, every stain, with the precision of an artist hiding flaws in a masterpiece. If neighbors asked about me, she would smile sweetly and say I was finding my path, while in private she spat words like failure and disappointment. When teachers called about my slipping grades, she smoothed it over with practiced charm, insisting I was just distracted, but brilliant underneath. Margaret lived in a constant state of performance, and I was the unwanted improvisation she couldn't control. Gerald, as always, played the role of the absent father, though in truth, his detachment felt heavier than presence ever could. I used to think he didn't care, that his silence was proof of indifference. But as I grew older, I began to sense something deeper, guilt, buried beneath the whiskey and the avoidance. He would sometimes linger in the hallway outside my room after one of Margaret's tirades, his shadow flickering under the door like a ghost. He never knocked, never spoke, but I knew he was there, listening, regretting, perhaps even ashamed of his cowardice. His silence wasn't empty. It was loaded, heavy, and it pressed down on me just as much as her cruelty did. Daniel, of course, thrived in those years, though his privilege carried shadows of its own. He wore his status as golden child like a crown, basking in the endless praise showered on him. But sometimes, when the applause quieted, I caught glimpses of something else in his eyes. Envy, for all the disdain I endured, for all the accusations and punishments. I had something he didn't. Freedom from the crushing weight of perfection. He lived on a pedestal, but pedestals are prisons, and he envied my defiance even as he mocked it. His smiles were sharpened by jealousy, his victories hollowed by the fear of falling from grace. Meanwhile, the family gossip grew like weeds in the dark. Relatives whispered about me at gatherings, their words dripping with judgment that Margaret had carefully seeded. Natalie's always been difficult. She's rebellious, ungrateful. Daniel, on the other hand, what a fine young man. I became the family's cautionary tale, the scapegoat whose failures were magnified so others could feel superior. Every mistake of mine became public knowledge, while Daniel's flaws were erased, rewritten as charming quirks. The narrative was set. Natalie, the problem. Daniel, the pride. And once spoken enough, the story became its own truth, a weight I couldn't shake. Desperate for relief, I once begged my mother to let me see a therapist. I had found a brochure at school, tucked it away in my bag, and showed it to her one afternoon. My hands trembled as I explained how heavy everything felt, how I needed someone to talk to. She looked at me as though I had confessed a crime. "Therapy is for people who can't control themselves," she snapped, her tone dripping with disdain. "You're not sick, Natalie. You're dramatic." She tore the brochure in half, letting the pieces fall to the floor, and walked away without another word. That day, I learned that my pain was not just invisible to her. It was inconvenient, a blemish on her spotless facade. The house itself seemed to echo the suppression that defined us, walls lined with family portraits that showed smiling faces, though the reality behind those smiles was rot and silence. The air felt heavy, suffused with things unsaid, truths buried so deep they became part of the foundation. Conversations were shallow, laughter hollow, dinners suffocating. Any attempt to break the silence, to ask real questions, to voice real pain, was met with glares or dismissals. We lived in a museum of illusions, each of us frozen in roles Margaret had assigned. The silence wasn't just oppressive, it was survival. It was during those years that the seeds of confrontation were planted, watered by every injustice, every suppressed cry for help. I didn't know then how or when they would bloom, but I felt them growing inside me, roots digging deep, branches straining for light. Each secret she kept, each humiliation she inflicted, each silence my father chose, added fuel to the fire I carried. I might have been cast as the scapegoat, but I was no longer the weak child who cowered in school hallways. I was becoming someone else, someone who would one day refuse to be silent. Margaret had built her empire on silence, but she didn't realize she was raising the very storm that would one day destroy it. The sting on my cheek had not faded. It pulsed like a living thing, each heartbeat fanning the flames of rage that surged inside me. I could feel the heat climbing up my neck, spreading across my chest, until it felt as though the entire room were suffocating me. My breath came shallow, deliberate, because if I let it break, I knew the tears would follow. Around me, the room remained frozen in shock. The laughter that once echoed had died, replaced by the eerie silence of people too stunned to move. It was as though time had stopped at the exact moment my mother's hand connected with my face, trapping us all in that cruel echo. Relatives who had been mid-bite were still clutching forks, paralyzed as if unsure whether to continue eating or to look away. My aunt's face had gone pale, her hand trembling so hard that the wine in her glass rippled like a disturbed pond. A cousin's jaw hung slack, the lamb cooling on her plate untouched. Even Gerald, who so often stared at his drink as if the amber liquid held all the answers, looked momentarily shaken. But no one spoke. No one rushed to defend me. They simply stared, trapped between complicity and horror, waiting to see what role they would be forced to play in this unfolding drama. Daniel, of course, broke the silence with nothing more than a smirk. His lips curved just slightly, enough for me to see the triumph glinting in his eyes. For him, my humiliation was a victory, proof, once again, that I was the designated failure of the family, the one who could never escape Margaret's wrath. He leaned back casually in his chair, sipping his wine as though the violence were entertainment. The sight of his smugness filled me with an anger so sharp it cut through the shame. My brother's satisfaction became fuel, kindling the fire already burning in my veins. Margaret, meanwhile, sat back with the serenity of a queen who had just executed a traitor. Her back was straight, her shoulders square, her face composed in a mask of icy satisfaction. She didn't need to say another word. The slap had been her statement, her declaration of absolute control. She waited, eyes locked on me, daring me to retaliate, knowing that for years I had chosen silence over rebellion. She believed I would fold, as I always had, letting the humiliation sink into my bones, while she basked in her own power. To her, this was victory, another reminder that I would never rise above her reach. But as I sat there, heat radiating from my skin, I remembered every moment I had swallowed my pain in silence, every time I had bowed my head to avoid her glare, every night I had cried quietly in my room so no one would hear. I remembered the school hallway, her nails digging into my arm, her words hissing that I was weak. I remembered begging for therapy, only to be dismissed as dramatic. I remembered being compared to Daniel, the golden sun, until I believed I was nothing. All those memories surged through me like waves crashing against a dam, and the dam was breaking. For the first time in my life, I knew. Tonight could not be another moment of silence. If I let it pass, if I let her win again, I would never escape the chains she had fastened around me since childhood. I could feel something in me hardening, sharpening into resolve. My shame no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a weapon, forged by years of suppression. My rage was no longer a weakness to hide. It was a force demanding to be unleashed. The decision crystallized inside me with terrifying clarity. I would not stay quiet this time. Tonight, I would speak. The chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor as I pushed it back, the sound harsh, cutting through the suffocating silence like a blade. Every head turned toward me, eyes widening, lips parting in anticipation. My legs trembled as I stood, but my spine was straighter than it had ever been. My hands shook at my sides, not with fear, but with the sheer magnitude of what I was about to do. The air thickened, heavy with expectation, as though everyone in the room had been holding their breath since the slap. My voice, when it finally broke the silence, trembled at first, but steadied with each word. I felt the vibration in my chest, the unfamiliar strength in my throat, as I spoke for all the versions of myself who had been silenced before. The room seemed to lean toward me, bracing for an explosion, waiting to see if I would scream, cry, or collapse. Even Margaret's mask flickered, a tiny twitch at the corner of her eye, as though she sensed the tide turning. For the first time, it wasn't just her stage, it was mine too. And I was ready to burn the script she had written for me. When my voice finally pierced the silence, it wasn't a scream. It was something sharper, steadier, and far more dangerous. "Enough," I said, the word trembling at first, but gaining weight as it left my lips. My mother's eyes narrowed, clearly expecting me to collapse into tears or apologies, but I didn't. I stood tall, my cheeks still burning, my body trembling with adrenaline, and I let the silence hang for a moment longer. Then I spoke again, louder this time, my words carrying through the heavy air. "You've spent your entire life breaking me down, Margaret. Every insult, every humiliation, every lie you've spun about me. It ends tonight." The table gasped softly at my use of her first name. It was no longer Mother. It was Margaret. Her mask flickered, just slightly, but she recovered quickly, lips pressed into a thin line. "Sit down," she hissed, her voice cold, but I didn't move. For the first time in years, I had her full attention, and I wasn't about to give it up. "No," I said, louder. "You've treated me like dirt for as long as I can remember, while parading Daniel as the perfect son. You've crushed me under your thumb, mocked me in front of this family, and pretended you were the model mother. But they don't know the truth, do they? They don't know what you've been hiding all these years." A nervous shuffle of chairs sounded around me as relatives leaned forward, their eyes darting from me to Margaret. I could see Margaret's composure beginning to fray, but she still tried to play her part. "Don't make a scene," she snapped, her tone dripping with practiced disdain. But my words had already sliced open the facade she had built, and there was no going back. "A scene?" I laughed bitterly. "The scene is your life, Margaret. This whole dinner is nothing but theater. You care more about these polished forks and perfect plates than you ever cared about me. You would rather bury the truth under linen and candles than admit the family you built is broken." Forks clattered onto plates as hands trembled, no one daring to interrupt. And then I dropped it. The secret that had sat heavy in my chest for years, the one I had stumbled upon as a teenager but never spoken aloud. How many here know about the affair? The room went silent, the air thick as stone. My words landed like a grenade on the table, shattering the illusion Margaret had so carefully crafted. Yes, the affair, the one you thought no one knew about, the late nights, the whispered phone calls, the lies about book club meetings. I turned slowly, meeting the shocked eyes of my relatives. "She's been lying to all of you, for years." The shift in the room was immediate. Gerald's head jerked up, his eyes flashing with something I had never seen in him before. Not shock, but recognition. He knew. Of course he knew. The whiskey glass in his hand trembled slightly, the amber liquid sloshing as his fingers tightened around it. He didn't deny it. He didn't even look at her. Instead, his gaze fell to the table, heavy with a grief that looked years old, as though he had been carrying the weight of her betrayal. long before I had dared to say it aloud. For once, his silence spoke volumes. Daniel's smirk vanished in an instant, the arrogance drained from his face, replaced with something that almost looked like fear. He leaned forward, eyes darting between Margaret and Gerald, as though calculating the damage. Perhaps he wasn't afraid of the affair itself, but of what else I might expose. He knew I carried more than one secret, and for the first time, his confidence cracked. His hand gripped the stem of his wineglass so tightly, I thought it might snap. For all his years of mocking me, of feeding off my humiliation, he realized now that the spotlight could shift, and that I was capable of turning it directly on him. The sound of gasps rippled down the table, a symphony of disbelief and horror. Forks dropped, glasses shattered against the hardwood floor as trembling hands lost their grip. My aunt covered her mouth with both hands. My cousins exchanged frantic glances, and no one dared to speak. The illusion had been shattered, and in the ruins lay the truth they had never expected to face. The tension in the air was unbearable, pressing down on each of us like a storm about to break. It was no longer just my rebellion. It was a reckoning for the entire family. Margaret's mask began to crack before my eyes. Her shoulders stiffened, her lips quivered, her carefully composed poise unraveling thread by thread. For once, she didn't have a quick retort or a venomous insult. She sat frozen, eyes flashing with fury and fear, realizing she had lost control of the narrative. The stage she had built for decades was collapsing around her, and no amount of polished silver or forced smiles could save it. For the first time in my life, I saw her not as invincible, but as vulnerable, a woman desperately clinging to the shards of her own illusion. And as I stood there, my voice echoing in the ruins of her lies, I felt something I had never known before: liberation. It rushed through me like oxygen after years of suffocation, like fire breaking through ice. My hands no longer trembled, my voice no longer shook. The silence had been shattered, the truth laid bare, and for the first time, it was Margaret, not me, who was exposed, fragile, and stripped of her power. I had broken the chains of her control, and I knew I would never wear them again. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Gerald's voice broke through the chaos. It was low at first, gravelly from years of swallowing words, but it carried a weight that silenced even the gasps around us. "She's telling the truth," he said, and the table froze as if struck by lightning. Margaret's head snapped toward him, eyes wide in fury and disbelief, but he didn't look at her. He looked at me. Natalie has been treated like an outcast in this house for too long, and I should have stopped it. My heart slammed in my chest as his gaze lingered on me, almost apologetic, almost pleading, as if he was finally acknowledging my existence. Margaret exploded, her chair screeching against the polished wood as she stood. "You dare take her side?" she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "After everything I've done for this family, after everything I've sacrificed, you betray me now, in front of them?" Her words struck the air like venom, but they were no longer landing the way she expected. The relatives didn't nod in agreement, didn't rush to her defense. Instead, they watched her unravel, her arms flailing as though she could gather the shards of her collapsing kingdom back into place. She had built her life on domination, and now, control was slipping like sand through her fingers. Daniel's voice cut through the air, sharp and bitter. "Don't act like this is some great betrayal, Mother. You've never cared about anyone but yourself." The word shocked me, nearly more than the slap had. For the first time, Daniel's polished mask of superiority fractured, revealing something raw beneath. "You pushed me into being perfect, the golden boy, the flawless son. Do you know how suffocating it is to be your trophy?" His hand slammed on the table, making glasses rattle. "You paraded me like an achievement, but you never saw me either. Not really. You only saw what you wanted." His eyes glistened with a rage I had never thought him capable of admitting. Margaret's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her son's rebellion was the betrayal she never imagined, the one blade she could never dodge. She staggered back, clutching the edge of her chair, her carefully crafted walls crumbling. The relatives whispered among themselves, their voices like a growing storm. My aunt muttered, "I always thought something was wrong," while a cousin's voice trembled. She never treated Natalie fairly. The room was dividing, splintering into those who could no longer deny the truth, and those still clinging to the image of perfection Margaret had forced upon them. The collapse of the facade was no longer a possibility. It was happening, piece by piece. I turned my gaze to Gerald, the man who had hidden behind silence all these years, enabling Margaret's cruelty with his passivity. Why now? I asked, my voice hard, demanding. Why did you let her destroy me year after year? Why did you sit there while I begged for love and got nothing but disgust? His lips trembled, and for once tears welled in his eyes. Because I was a coward, he whispered, and the confession cut deeper than I expected. Because every time I thought about standing up for you, I saw how quickly she'd turn her wrath on me, and I told myself you were strong enough to survive. I was wrong, Natalie. I failed you. My hands shook, not from weakness, but from the sheer force of everything being dragged into the light. I looked at Daniel, his face twisted with fury, and I spoke directly to him. You mocked me for years, enjoyed watching her humiliate me, all so you could keep your crown, and now you're angry because you've realized you were a prisoner too. Don't you dare pretend you didn't benefit from my suffering. His lips pressed tight, shame flickering across his features, and for the first time, he had no clever insult, no smirk to hide behind. The silence between us was heavier than any scream. The relatives' voices rose, a chorus of disbelief and fury that turned the dinner table into a battlefield. My aunt slammed her hand down, shouting at Margaret for lying to everyone for years. A cousin stood, accusing Daniel of bullying me at family gatherings while Margaret laughed it off. Even the younger ones stared in wide-eyed shock, their illusions shattered in real time. Rage, shame, grief, they flooded the room, colliding in waves that broke against the fragile shell of family that had once held us together. Plates lay forgotten, food congealing under the heat of the chaos. I felt myself rise taller, not just in body but in spirit, as I faced them all. This is the truth, I said, my voice resonating above the storm. The perfect family you worshipped never existed. It was built on cruelty, on silence, on lies, and if it takes my blood on the floor and a slap to my face to finally open your eyes, then so be it. But I will not play the scapegoat anymore. Not tonight. Not ever again. And in that moment, the dinner ceased to be a celebration and became a reckoning, a final trial where each of us was forced to face who we truly were, stripped of illusions. The room had become a crucible, thick with the smoke of exposed truths, and I could feel every eye on me as though I had set fire to the very walls of the house. Plates lay abandoned, forks and knives stilled in midair as if they, too, were stunned into silence, while the candles flickered against the crystal glasses, casting warped reflections on faces now twisted in anger, confusion, and fear. Margaret stood frozen at the head of the table, her chest rising and falling in sharp bursts, her hand gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles turned white. She looked like a queen whose crown had been stripped, a ruler facing rebellion from her own subjects, and the fury in her eyes was unlike anything I had seen. But beneath it, I detected something else, a flash of panic, a sudden awareness that her empire of control had begun to crumble, and no matter how hard she tried, the pieces would not fit together again. Gerald sat rigid in his chair, as if cemented to the seat, his confession hanging in the air like a ghost that refused to leave. For so many years, he had been a shadow, an ornament in Margaret's carefully constructed illusion of a family, but now he had stepped, however reluctantly, into the light. His admission of cowardice had cracked something deeper than Margaret's mask. It had cracked the silence that had bound all of us, a silence heavier than stone. He looked smaller now, hunched, his once stoic frame shrunken beneath the weight of guilt that seemed to spill over him in waves. For a fleeting moment, I almost pitied him, but the sting of years of abandonment was stronger, and pity turned to bitterness. He had let me drown over and over, while he clung to the illusion of safety, and now his words, though raw, could not undo the scars carved into me. Daniel's face, once smug with the satisfaction of being the golden child, was contorted in a storm of emotions he had spent his life denying. His jaw clenched and unclenched, his hand restless against the polished wood of the table as though itching to lash out. But his eyes betrayed him. He was trembling, not from anger alone, but from the unfamiliar sensation of being exposed. For so long, he had hidden behind Mother's approval, thriving in the shadow of her favoritism, believing himself untouchable while I bore the weight of her contempt. But now, his words of resentment had cracked his own facade, revealing a boy who had lived imprisoned by expectations, performing perfection like a trick for an ungrateful audience. His gaze flickered to me, and for the first time, it was not laced with disdain, but with something closer to fear, as if he knew I had the power to unravel him completely. The relatives, once passive spectators to Margaret's cruelty, were unraveling in their own way. My aunt's voice, sharp and cutting, accused Margaret of being manipulative, her words gaining strength with each syllable, as if years of suspicion had finally found their outlet. Cousins murmured among themselves, no longer hiding their disgust or disbelief, recalling the many times they had watched me humiliated while they laughed nervously, unsure whether to intervene. Now they shifted in their seats, guilt gnawing at them for their complicity, for their silence that had allowed Margaret's reign to continue unchecked. The younger ones stared wide-eyed, watching idols crumble, learning in real time that adults were not always protectors, but sometimes architects of pain. The family unity that Margaret had paraded for years was collapsing into factions, a house divided, the air heavy with betrayal. Margaret, however, would not surrender without a fight. Her voice rose above the chaos, shrill, commanding, demanding attention, as it always had. "You are all liars," she hissed, her eyes scanning the table as if searching for one loyal follower who would restore her power. This is nothing but an attack orchestrated by an ungrateful child who has always tried to ruin me. Do not be fooled by her lies." She pointed a trembling finger at me, her fury palpable, her voice cracking under the strain of desperation. Yet the conviction that once made people cower seemed weaker now, faltering under the weight of truth. The power she wielded like a blade had dulled, and the more she spoke, the more hollow her authority sounded, exposing the emptiness at its core. I stood taller, refusing to shrink back into the silence that had defined me for so long. My voice did not rise in anger, but instead cut with a calmness that silenced the room in a different way. "They are not my lies, Mother," I said, each word slow, deliberate, heavy with the years of pain behind them. "They are your truths, and for the first time, you cannot hide them." The stillness that followed was almost suffocating, every breath in the room caught in the air. Margaret's lips parted as if to argue, but no words came, her eyes darting from face to face, realizing that even her most loyal allies were wavering. I felt the tremor of liberation surge through me, a fire that burned brighter than my shame, stronger than my fear. Then came the eruption. Gerald, in a voice that was no longer trembling, declared that he was done protecting Margaret's image, that he would not continue living in silence. Daniel slammed his glass down so hard it shattered, shards scattering across the table like pieces of the family itself, his anger at both Mother and himself spiraling into something dangerous and unrestrained. My aunt's voice overlapped with his, accusations and denials colliding in a storm of noise, while cousins shouted to be heard, each voice adding fuel to the inferno. The perfect dinner Margaret had staged had transformed into chaos incarnate, a battlefield of words, tears, and rage, where the table no longer united us, but divided us with fractures too deep to mend. In the midst of it all, I felt a strange, steady calm settle over me, as though I had been waiting for this collapse my entire life. The noise swirled around me like a hurricane, yet I was the still center, the eye of the storm, watching the empire of lies dissolve into ashes. I realized then that this was not destruction, it was rebirth. The family I had known was gone, shattered beyond repair, but perhaps that was the only way for something real to emerge from the wreckage. The truth had finally been spoken, and though it left scars, it also left freedom. The dinner that began with humiliation had become the night of reckoning, and as the walls of silence fell, I understood that nothing would ever be the same again. The aftermath was not silence, but something far more unsettling, the fractured echoes of voices that no longer carried authority, that no longer belonged to the people I thought I knew. The dinner table looked like the ruins of a battlefield, glasses shattered, plates smeared with food gone cold, napkins discarded like torn flags in surrender. The candles sputtered, their wax spilling over, as if even they had lost the will to hold their form. My cheek still burned from the slap, but the sting of my mother's hand had been swallowed by something larger, something that pressed against my chest until I thought I might shatter too. My ears rang with the sounds of broken illusions, my aunt sobbing into her hands, cousins whispering frantically, Gerald's heavy breaths as if each inhale was his first in years, and Margaret, standing rigid, trembling with the hatred of a woman who had been stripped of her throne. I could not look away from her. Margaret's face, usually so controlled, so perfectly curated like the polished silver she adored displaying, had twisted into something raw and jagged. Her eyes darted across the table as though searching for an ally, but found only shadows of disappointment. She had built her kingdom on fear and silence, demanding obedience and shaping reality through the sheer force of her will, and now the kingdom had fallen in one evening. Her lips trembled as she tried to form words, but they came out brittle, breaking apart before they could hold meaning. For a fleeting second, I wondered if she would collapse, if the woman who had spent her life towering over me would crumble into dust before my eyes. But she held on, rigid, desperate, refusing to give me the satisfaction of seeing her destroyed. Gerald spoke next, his voice like gravel dragged across stone, rough and tired. "I should have stopped this years ago," he whispered, though the whisper carried across the room with the weight of confession. His eyes met mine, not as a father to a daughter, but as a guilty man seeking absolution he would never fully receive. "I let you suffer, Natalie. I let her do what she did because I was afraid, and that will haunt me until my last breath." The words should have healed me, should have offered some small balm after years of abandonment, but they only carved deeper wounds. I had long fantasized about him speaking up, about him acknowledging my pain, but hearing it now, after all the damage was done, was like receiving a lifeboat long after you had already drowned. It was too late. His remorse could not rewind my childhood, could not give me back the love I had begged for in silence. Daniel's voice broke through the tension, sharp and shaking, full of venom, yet tinged with something that sounded dangerously close to despair. "You don't get to play the hero now, Dad," he spat, leaning forward, his hand still bleeding from the glass he had shattered minutes earlier. "You let her destroy us. You let her turn us into pieces on her chessboard, and you watched while we tore each other apart. You think confessing now changes anything?" His eyes flicked to me, but this time there was no smirk, no superiority. There was only a hollow ache, a reflection of the years he had been smothered under the weight of being the golden child, adored but never truly loved. His anger wasn't just for Gerald, it was for Margaret, for himself, for the roles we had all been forced to play in her theater of perfection. The relatives grew restless, shifting in their seats, their own carefully constructed views of the family crumbling in real time. My aunt's tears had given way to sharp accusations, her voice cutting through the room like glass shattering against tile. She recalled memories that now resurfaced with clarity, the subtle cruelties she had witnessed but chosen to ignore, the times she had swallowed discomfort because Margaret's approval had felt too precious to lose. My cousins' faces reflected a dawning horror, as though they were seeing the truth of our family for the first time, realizing that their laughter and complicity had been part of my torment. Their shame was palpable, but it did not soften me. They, too, had been comfortable in silence, and silence had been my prison. The storm seemed endless, voices colliding, accusations piling, until I felt I might choke on the chaos. And yet, in that chaos, I felt something shifting inside me, something that had been dormant for far too long. The Natalie who once cowered at her mother's words, who silenced herself for the sake of peace, was gone. In her place was someone who could no longer be dismissed, no longer erased. I rose to my feet, my chair scraping back against the floor, a sound so sharp it silenced even the loudest voices. All eyes turned to me, and for the first time, I felt no fear in their gaze. My voice trembled at first, but steadied as the words poured out like water breaking through a dam. "This ends tonight," I said. "No more silence, no more lies, no more pretending this family is anything but broken." Margaret's eyes blazed, but her voice faltered when she tried to answer me. "You think you've won?" she hissed, her body shaking with fury. "You've always been nothing, Natalie. Nothing but a mistake. You can scream your lies as loud as you want, but you'll never—" Her words cut off abruptly, choked by the weight of her own trembling. The certainty that had always defined her had drained away, leaving her voice cracked and brittle. I stared at her, no longer a frightened child, but a woman who could see her mother for what she truly was. Not a monster with infinite power, but a human being clinging desperately to the shards of control she had left. And in that moment, something shifted irreversibly between us. I no longer sought her love. I no longer needed her approval. The room sat in stunned silence once more, but it was different from the silence after the slap. This silence was not suffocating but liberating, the air cleared by the storm, the lies burned away in the fire of confrontation. Around me, the family sat broken, divided, exposed, and yet for the first time I felt no shame in their presence. My face still burned, my heart still ached, but I stood taller, heavier with truth, lighter with freedom. The dinner was over, but the reckoning had just begun, and as I looked at each of them, Gerald slumped in regret, Daniel trembling with suppressed rage, my aunt pale with guilt, Margaret shaking in her ruined throne. I knew that this night had changed everything. We would never return to what we were, and maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something real. The room had become unrecognizable from the polished, orchestrated dining hall I had walked into hours before. Plates lay shattered, glasses overturned, silverware scattered like weapons abandoned mid-battle, and the soft golden glow of the chandelier now cast distorted shadows across the chaos. Margaret sat slumped in her chair, her once imperious posture broken, her carefully maintained mask shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, revealing raw panic and the tremors of a woman who had finally realized she was powerless. Gerald's face was pale, etched with guilt and exhaustion, as though he had aged decades in the last few hours, each line a testimony to decades of silence. Daniel, normally unflappable, sat frozen, hands clenched tightly in his lap, eyes darting from Margaret to me with a mixture of fear, anger, and disbelief that left him almost unrecognizable. And I, Natalie, stood at the center of it all, feeling the adrenaline of confrontation slowly morphing into a strange calm that vibrated through my entire body, steadying my heart, even as the storm around me raged. I took a slow breath and let the silence stretch for a moment, letting everyone feel the weight of the words unspoken. "This," I began, my voice low but cutting, "is the truth of our family. For decades we've been hiding behind lies, pretending that perfection could mask cruelty, pretending that shame and fear were love, but it ends tonight." I looked at each person in turn, my gaze holding theirs, not with accusation, but with clarity, with authority born from years of enduring what they could not see. Margaret, you wanted obedience. Gerald, you wanted peace at any cost. Daniel, you wanted approval. And I said, my chest swelling with power, I wanted love, but none of you gave it freely, and none of you cared to see the pain it caused me. And now, you must face it. Margaret's lips trembled, her eyes narrowing dangerously, as though she were searching for a loophole in reality, a way to undo the exposure of her secrets. "You think you can destroy me with words, Natalie?" she hissed, voice rising despite the trembling that betrayed her. "I built this family. I maintained it, and you will not stand here and tear it apart in front of them." But I stepped closer, the fire in my chest radiating outward, and said simply, "No, Mother. You've already destroyed yourself. This is not my doing. This is the inevitable collapse of the empire you built on fear, lies, and control. You had power over me for years, but that ends now." Her eyes darted to Gerald, who shifted uneasily, realizing that the foundations of the life he had enabled were also crumbling beneath him. Daniel's face was a storm of conflicting emotions. "So this is it," he barked, finally breaking the silence that had held him captive. "You expose her, and suddenly I'm supposed to feel guilt too?" His voice cracked, revealing a vulnerability that I had never seen before. "You think it's easy to live in her shadow, to be her golden child, while watching her crush everything else. Don't pretend you understand. It's been hell for all of us, just in different ways." I met his gaze, unflinching, and said, "I understand exactly what it's been like, Daniel. But unlike you, I had no shield, no pedestal to hide behind. You were complicit in my silence, and now you have to confront the truth, just like the rest of us." The tension was palpable, as if the entire room were holding its breath, waiting for someone to shatter completely. Then Gerald spoke again, his voice now firmer, as though he had finally shed the cloak of fear that had silenced him all these years. "We've all failed," he admitted, his eyes glistening, not with tears, but with the weight of accumulated shame. "I failed you, Natalie, by allowing her to harm you, and by hiding behind silence. Daniel, I failed you too, by teaching you that approval is more valuable than honesty or compassion. And Margaret, I enabled you, and that is on me as much as it is on you." His confession hung in the air like smoke from a fire, enveloping the room, suffocating in its intensity. For the first time, it felt like truth had not only been spoken, it had begun to demand justice. Margaret's hands trembled as she gripped the arms of her chair, her carefully maintained poise now utterly gone. You think this changes anything?" she stammered, voice breaking despite her fury. "I am your mother. I am your family." Her words were almost a plea, and for the first time, I realized that her cruelty had been rooted in fear of exposure, fear of losing control, fear of being truly seen. I said nothing at first, letting her panic simmer in the silence. Then, calmly, I stated, "Being your daughter doesn't mean being your prisoner. Being your mother doesn't give you the right to erase me. This is over, Margaret. I am no longer yours to control." The words landed like hammers, final and undeniable. The room seemed to shudder as my declaration rippled through everyone. Forks clattered against plates forgotten in the chaos, glasses teetered on the edge of the table, and the family I had known for decades began to dissolve into something unrecognizable. Some began weeping openly, others stared in stunned silence, and a few tried desperately to cling to fragments of the illusion Margaret had maintained for so long. But none could stop the truth now. It had taken root in the open air, and it would not be buried again. The walls of our house, once filled with unspoken fear, now vibrated with honesty, raw and painful and liberating all at once. Finally, I turned away from the table, feeling the weight of decades lift with every step. My body trembled with exhaustion, my chest heaving, but my spirit felt lighter than it had in a lifetime. For the first time, I did not feel small, unseen, or insignificant. Margaret slumped further. Gerald looked hollow but relieved, and Daniel's eyes held a cautious, newfound respect, mingled with lingering resentment. The rest of the family shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond to a reality they had ignored for years, and I realized then that the shock, the pain, and the confrontation were not the end, but the beginning of something far more authentic, a family exposed to truth, whether they were ready for it or not. As I left the dining room, stepping over shards of glass and the remnants of a carefully staged illusion, I felt a strange calm envelop me. Every step carried the weight of survival and defiance. For the first time, I was no longer Natalie, the silent child, the scapegoat, the one who endured. I was Natalie, the one who stood, the one who spoke, the one who survived not only the cruelty of a mother, but the silence of everyone who should have protected me. Outside, the night air was cool and indifferent, but I breathed it in like freedom, knowing that even if the family I had known could never be repaired, I had reclaimed myself, and in that moment, I understood with absolute certainty, no slap, no lie, no betrayal could ever silence me again.